our continuing look at the scripture readings for the next Sunday. This would be the 17th Sunday of the year. And the readings chosen for this week are, the first reading comes from the book of Kings, first book of Kings, chapter 3, verses 5 and then verses 7 and 12. Come back to that a little bit later in our look today. Second reading is from Romans, again, as we've mentioned before, all through these weeks, the section from Romans letter of Paul are being given us. Today it's from chapter 8, verses 28 to 30. And the gospel is, again, chapter 13 of Matthew's gospel, verses 44 to 52. So those would be the readings that we're asked to reflect on this time. Over the last 2 weeks, we have been looking at sections from chapter 13 of Matthew's Gospel, which are, as you remember, a series of parables, teachings that Jesus is pictured as giving, pictures that we've looked at of what the kingdom of God, or as Matthew calls it, the kingdom of heaven, would be like. We saw the story of the sower who sowed the seeds, story of the wheat and the weeds, the story of the yeast placed into the measure of flour. So all of that has been what we've looked at so far. Today we look at the remaining parables that are told in this chapter. Namely, we're going to see a buried treasure, a man who searches for a pearl of great price, and then a story of the Dragnet, which was not a TV series, but something that is used to bring in the fish that was part of the style of fishing in first century world. So we begin with a buried treasure. This is found in verse 44. And it pictures that a man, presuming a man, maybe it was a lady, but usually it's the man, who discovers in a field a treasure. And when he discovers the treasure, he buries it and then goes and attempts to buy that field. Now, in this case, the audience are only the disciples. For the earlier parables that we looked at in the last couple weeks, there was an audience including the disciples, but also what the writer calls the crowd. So remember that Jesus had been pictured as teaching in a boat off the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now in this case, it looks as if they've come ashore and that Jesus is now giving some advice to only the disciples. So the buried treasure. Well, here's the problem. Why would someone bury a treasure in a field, if not owning it? Well, here's the question. Why would people bury a treasure in the first place? Because, believe it or not, it probably was better than any kind of bank or safe that they might have. You buried the treasure, nobody knew where you buried it. Of course, the problem with the person burying the treasure is that he had to remember where he buried it. Was it under some tree or behind some rock, or was it just in the wide open space? For whatever reason, the man had buried a treasure. Now we can only hope or surmise rather, that treasure was something important. Perhaps it was gold, perhaps it was silver. It probably wasn't something agricultural because that wouldn't last too long. So it had to be something with a certain substance to it that truly made it a treasure. Could have been jewels, maybe his wife's jewels. Well, anyway, it could have been her jewels buried there. And The question now is, what happened to the person who put the treasure there in that field? And there are a number of possibilities as to what had happened. Maybe the person had died. Well, now there was a real issue. If he didn't tell anybody that he had buried this treasure and where it was, it truly became lost in that sense. Or perhaps, as I say, he had died without telling anyone about this treasure. So therefore that gave it a kind of anonymity all of its own. Perhaps the man who had buried it had forgotten the precise location where he buried it. Now, I'm not saying he had Alzheimer's, but something caused him to forget. You know, that happens to some of us. We forget where we have put things, and now he has forgotten where he buried the treasure. Oh, it was under a rock. Yeah, but which rock in the field? Well, you know, the one, yeah, okay. So that was a problem. Or perhaps the land that had been owned by somebody else passed into possession of a foreign power. Maybe the Romans had come in and taken over that area. So that would be a way in which the treasure became lost. Or perhaps the wealthy landowner who owned the land was not able to reclaim it. And when he sold that property, the present owner did not know that the treasure was there. So there are any number of explanations as to how this treasure literally became lost. Now, somebody, for whatever reasons, is digging around in this field. Perhaps it's the new owner. Perhaps it's a day laborer who is doing some work and kind of accidentally uncovers this treasure. Or perhaps it's one who had leased the land. In other words, it had been leased to him, and he is digging around, and the one who owns the lease at this point is the one who finds the treasure. Or perhaps, all kinds of explanations are given, it was an independent contractor who had been asked to kind of organize this field, we suspect for agricultural reasons, and had come upon the treasure. So those are some possibilities. Now, just imagine that you had accidentally discovered this treasure. Were you obliged to tell the owner of the field that you had discovered this treasure? Because now the question was, who owns this treasure? Given all the different transactions that had taken place, does the discoverer own it? Or does it belong to the person who owns the land and who has possession of it? It now becomes a kind of moral issue. Do you tell the owner of the property that there's a treasure there? Well, now we say the man went and sold everything to buy that field. But who did he buy it from? And did he tell the person he was buying it from the rationale for his doing it? You know it because we're hearing the story of the parable, but what about the man who is selling this property to this owner who's willing to pay a price for it, thinking that it's, well, he wants it for agricultural or whatever reasons, not knowing that there's a treasure there? So the whole question of the buried treasure raises a number of interesting questions. The Talmud, which is the great Jewish book, but a series of laws that were not really put together in a written form until about the year 200 of Common Time, so that would be well after Jesus' time, that these laws were put down, and the Talmud today remains still for the Jewish community a very important series of laws which were put together roughly over a period of about 200 to 300 years, from the earliest being what's known as the Mishnah, put into place about the year 200. And anyway, the Talmud says that the finder is obligated to look for the treasurer's owner. and that newly purchased land belongs to the previous owner, not to the new owner. Now that's what the Talmud says, but again, it would not have been operative in Jesus' time or even in New Testament times. But maybe just because it was written down, the law was still in place. So there is this moral question: who owns the treasure that has been discovered? The discoverer, the owner of the land, the previous owner of the land. Anyway, for this treasure, the discoverer is willing to sell everything and goes to buy it. Where your heart is, there your treasure is. So part of this little parable's challenge is to raise the question, how much are you willing to give for the treasure? Treasure in this case might well be the faith or the belief we have. The second little parable, which is verses 45 through 46, is a pearl of great price. Well, now, this is a little different because here is a merchant who is looking for something of importance and who, when he finds it, is willing to pay a great price to have it. Now, so in the first parable, it's discovered kind of accidentally. You probably could say this pearl is discovered accidentally too, but the difference is that the merchant is looking for it. Now, you always got to keep in mind in the first century world, and even in our own time, that merchants tend to be sometimes shady characters. They're looking for a good deal so that then they can purchase it and sell it for a profit. So this is not going to be a question of just kind of accidentally, oh, by the way, I discovered something, but indeed is personally looking for it. And so in his deliberateness, he does find this pearl. As I say, there's a negativeness to merchants who could be, as you might guess, ruthless businessmen at times, often looking for a profit, or he could be a righteous, rich person who is earnestly seeking good, and in this case, seeking God. Anyway, in both cases, the finder is willing to sacrifice everything in order to purchase, in this case, the pearl, in the earlier case, to purchase the treasure. What is the question that is raised? Remember, good parables, little or short rather as these are, do raise the important question, what are you willing to give your all for? And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, the question, where your treasure is, there your heart is. And in another section in this gospel, Jesus is saying, look for a treasure where neither moth nor decay destroys, neither where thieves break in or steal. This is the kind of treasure of the heart, that truly should root us. I suspect is one of the ways in which this parable unfolds, or these two parables unfold, we should be seeking. The third parable here, which is kind of reminiscent of things that have been said earlier in this chapter, are found in verses 47 through 50, which is the net. Now, in a way, as I mentioned, it parallels the weeds and the wheat, where you remember at the end of the weeds and wheat, the weeds are bundled up and destroyed, and the wheat, of course, is put into barns. Here, of course, the fisherman throws a net. Now, this was a kind of interesting net that was used by fisher persons in the first century world. They were quite sturdy. People, as you know, did not go fishing by getting your fishing pole, putting a nice little worm on the end, throwing it into the water, and hoping that the unsuspecting fish would take the bite. That wasn't the way fishing was done. And there are a number of other instances in the Gospels where this style is illustrated. Namely, big nets were thrown out. Hopefully they would land in schools of fish. Hopefully they knew that the schools were in session. No, but often, and I say that because there were certain times of the day when they were not. So you had to know, as a good fisher person, when to go out and look for fish, okay? And you did not want one, but you wanted certainly a large number. So in this case, the parable says that there's a big catch. It brings in all that has been collected by the nets, and now the fisherman sits down and begins to sort them out. The good ones, the big ones, are put into one category or one pile. Those which are not. Now, there were certain kinds of fish, as you know, that were not edible or were not supposed to be eaten by the members of the Jewish community. This included any kind of fish that didn't have fins, any kind of fish that did not have scales, and any kind of shellfish. These were not edible fish, and so they would be the ones that would be put in a pile that would simply, well, I don't know that were thrown back into the water, but were destroyed. So you can see the weed and the weed idea here kind of played out in a little different way. This obviously would have been a story that would have appealed to many if the earlier parables had to do with seeding the land. Here now you have a story that has to do with the sea. And many of Jesus' disciples, at least the ones that we know, were fisher persons. They knew how this worked. And so as Jesus is telling this story to his disciples, they're saying, yes, we kind of get it. It does make sense to us. And so, again, there's an indication of the end of the things. Remember, we mentioned last time that one of the characteristics that was very prominent in the first century Christian world was that the glorious coming of Jesus, what we would call the eschatological age, was at hand and would happen at any time. And when we begin to kind of add a certain moral quality to this, and eschatology tended to have a moral quality. What do I mean by a moral quality? That goodness would be rewarded and that badness would be punished or would be rewarded. So here, at the end, the good fish would survive, the bad fish would not. That would be the point. And again, the old attitude that we saw earlier on, there needed to be a certain tolerance when you went fishing. If you only looked for the good fish, it would be very difficult with your net. So you inevitably brought in both kinds. And then, picturing the end time, would divide up and good would be, as they say, rewarded. So that's the story of the catch, the netting, or by the way, this was called a dragnet. I think I mentioned to you before. Maybe that's where even modern TV programs and the dragnet is you dragged in, you brought in everybody. See, that's what the police would do, sit them down and then question them and root out the good from the bad. You'd get and so even in modern times, we kind of know how that works in our language. And at this point, then the interpretation of the parables rather, that are told here comes to an end. Now, the first reading comes from the first book of Kings. Book of Kings, as you know, was there were two books of Kings, one of four books that describe what are known as the age of the great kings. In Israel's history, there were a number of kings, but the great kings was the triad of single monarchs who influenced the story of Judaism to a great degree. They, of course, were Saul, who was the first king, David, who, of course, was the great king, and Solomon, one of his sons, who assumed the throne of David at his death. The first and second books of Samuel, which are part of this quadrille of books, describes the rise of the fall of kings, of Saul, and finally of David. And then the second second series, first and second book of Kings, describes something of David's life and his son Solomon. Solomon is the character in the reading that is chosen for this week. When King David died, the picture that is presented is that God appears in a dream to Solomon and asks what he would like. Now, would he like riches? Would he like power? Would he like all the good things of life? Notice the treasures. In a certain way, you can see the connection with search for the treasures in the gospel today. What would you like, Solomon? And Solomon says to God, of course, who is the inspiration behind the dream that he has, I would like to have, it's an interesting phrase, a hearing heart. Well, that's what then Solomon is pictured as receiving. Another word for hearing is listening. There is a difference between hearing and listening, although in the Hebrew, the idea remains pretty much the same. And so Solomon will be known throughout his early reign for his juridical wisdom, his ability, therefore, to be a good ruler because he will listen to the concerns of the people whom he has been chosen to govern. There are three, those who put this together say there are three levels at which hearing takes place. Or there's the zone of the heart, which is symbolized by eyes. And this has to do with emotion and feeling. Then there's the zone of the mouth, which has to do with ears. And this is expressive of speech. Notice that in this section, Jesus is pictured as saying, let those who have ears to hear, hear. What I'm kind of seeing is taking place in these readings is an advocacy of the fact that Jesus is a great wisdom teacher. Now, much of the Gospel of Matthew traditionally has been seen as Jesus coming on the scene as the new Moses. And it is true that much of Matthew's Gospel does bank on events from Moses' life to show Jesus as the new Moses. But another thought, another series of interpreters of this gospel pictures something different. They picture Jesus as being a new wisdom, a kind of wisdom that surpasses the wisdom of Solomon. And this, therefore, brings us to the fact that there is the third zone, by the way, is the zone of the hands and feet, which means that not only does one know what is wise, speak what is wise, but also acts on wisdom. No, this is not hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. That's something else. But Solomon here is pictured as being very wise. At least he was at the start. And so I thought just for a few minutes we'd flesh out the rest of the Solomon story. We always like to choose the parts of Scripture that benefit the point that we're seeking to make and the good sometimes. Because Solomon, and of course, who does not remember the baby story? You remember that earlier on in his reign, there were two midwives. They come to Solomon one morning and say, we each had a child, but last night my baby died and the other ladies lived, and then the one says, the one who lost her baby went to mine, stole my baby, put it in my place, and put the dead baby in hers. Now Solomon is given with the situation of who's right. And to remember, his clever little device is bring the live baby and divide it in half. Give to each one a half of a child. Sounds like a half of a chicken. But, and of course, the mother of the living child says, no, please, just give the baby to the mother. And Solomon then says, this is the rightful mother. So that is the famous story of the wisdom of Solomon. Later on in Solomon's story, it says that the queen of the south, the queen of Sheba, has heard wonderful stories about Solomon and comes to hear him speak, to learn something of his wisdom. Solomon is remembered as building the magnificent temple that had been denied David. When David wanted to build it, he said, no, one of your sons will build it. But to Solomon's benefit, Dave had built up a lot of material that then Solomon used, or had his builders use, to build a beautiful temple. So some say it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, coated with gold and all through this temple. Temple, of course, you remember, in the ancient world, was not a place that people went into, but was the house that belonged to God. Anyway, Solomon was noted for the temple. Some people called it Solomon's temple. Later on in history, that's how it's described. So was Solomon very wise? Well, some of you may, if you read the book of Kings, will discover that Solomon had 1,000 wives. Now that must have kept him busy. Some of them were slave wives, others of them were. And of course, the explanation to that was that they didn't obviously all live in Jerusalem, but if you married the wife or made a wife rather of one of the daughters of one of the local kings, he would be a little hesitant to go against Solomon if he knew that his daughter was there. Solomon makes a number of other decisions as time goes on that shows maybe he wasn't always so wise, but we do speak of the wisdom of Solomon. And in fact, certain sections of the Old Testament are attributed to Solomon, as if he wrote the words of books like the Proverbs and the Book of Wisdom and Book of Sirach. Well, Sirach would kind of attend to a particular person. Or even many of the wise sayings that emerge are attributed to Solomon. So he becomes synonymous with wisdom, and here's the point, with wisdom. Jesus is the true wisdom, the new wisdom. And in the parables that we have heard now, that we'll hear this Sunday and over the last 2 weekends, Jesus wisely tells stories that affect people's lives, that encourage faith, that encourage folks to remain faithful to the seeds that are planted in their hearts, to the treasure that is theirs, the faith that is given to them, not to give up on it, to remain loyal. And basically, as we mentioned, Matthew is hoping his own community of believers will persist in this and will appreciate the great treasure that they have in Jesus, who is wisdom. And so in chapter 13 then, this is not the whole of chapter 13, but almost all of it puts together a beautiful portrait of Jesus, yes, as the new teacher, but in his teaching, he is wisdom enfleshed. And it is that wisdom that we hope, says the writer, to appreciate and, more importantly, to make our own. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.